Now I feel like we're a throwback to Verizon, guys. Can you hear me now? So I could only say that to a certain group of people that are my age, because I say that to people, younger people, they have no idea what I'm talking about. Can you hear me now? I call them incredibly spoiled because they have access to digital all the time, and they don't realize that there were times where you would actually hear a zzz before you actually had to do dial-up. Anyway, my name is Marîa Teresa Kumar. I am the founding president of Voto Latino. Voto Latino, we target American Latino millennials and increasingly Generation Z as well. For folks that don't realize that millennials are no longer young, they're 35. How many people are 35? There you go, right? It catches up with us. And we started, Voto Latino started 12 years ago as a digital first strategy, not because we had foresight of where the future was going, but because we didn't have any money. We were a nonprofit startup, and the idea was to try to capture as many hearts and minds of a growing group of Americans that no one was talking about, using technology, recognizing that they were leaders in their home long before they turned 18, because oftentimes they were the cultural translators, physically translating in the doctor's office, physically translating on behalf of their teachers and their parents, and they were English dominant. 12 years ago, people were telling us that we were nuts, that Latinos didn't speak English, that they didn't use technology, and that it was going to be almost impossible to mobilize these young people. 2 years after Voto Latino started, young people walked out of their classrooms organizing on MySpace. How many people remember MySpace? Now you appreciate why our work is incredibly difficult, because MySpace is no longer existing, so we're constantly trying to adapt to these cultural folks. But they marched by organizing with MySpace and text messaging. They were our Arab Spring 4 years before the Arab Spring, and they led to what I think is one of the reasons why we're having conversations on storytelling. They were at the forefront of a demographic revolution that this country wasn't prepared for in many ways. In the last 10 years, we've seen massive movements, not just that started with immigration reform, that led to 2 million people marching in the streets, but we've seen folks march for the environment in record mass. We've seen folks come out and march for LGBT community. We've seen them march for a woman's right to choose. We've seen folks march for Wage for 15. And more recently, we've seen folks march for Black Lives Matter. And then we take a step back and realize that the force of these movements has been, one, the lack of representation when it comes to these individual stories, where folks all of a sudden feel that the only way that they can have an outlet is to march. But then you see the beautiful stories coming out of those movements. The conversations that you heard earlier today, when you heard folks talk about mass incarceration, the deep personal story of gender and identity. And then what Bryce just recently shared is looking for that good story. All these movements caught so many Americans by surprise was because the mainstream media was absent from the storytelling. But when you go into the corners of America, you see these stories. People are living them, whether it's the Wage for 15, where you see a woman has just tragically die in her car because she'd been working for 3-hour jobs and died in her car of exhaustion, waiting to go to her next job. At Voto Latino, we also try to use stories to change things on its head. 3 years ago, we worked in partnership with MSNBC, with Lawrence O'Donnell. We had this wildest story come to our desk. Someone from Texas called me and said, you know what? I just watched on the news that a 13-year-old African-American girl was caught shoplifting and was deported to Colombia. What? It turned out that she was a 13-year-old runaway. She got afraid that she was going to be sent back home, so she gave the police a fictitious name. That fictitious name happened to coincide with a 21-year-old Colombian woman. They processed her and sent her back to Colombia. Colombians gave her working papers, the irony of that, and it wasn't until her grandmother found her on Facebook that she was able to identify where her granddaughter was. This young woman was not Latina. She did not speak Spanish. And so with Lawrence, we basically worked for a week. He basically started calling the State Department. The State Department finally recognized that they had done something wrong. The State Department finally said, okay, but now the grandmother has to pay for the ticket to fly her back from Colombia. This is all true. And finally, again, Lawrence was like a dog with a bone and finally said, no, I think the State Department should kind of give her ticket back home. But that's the power of storytelling and exposure. When people say that the immigration system is broken, no one understands how fractured the immigration system is until you start highlighting cases that are not unusual. Since 2000, the last study that's been done is 2011. Roughly 20,000 Americans have been caught in detention or deported accidentally. So as we continue this journey of storytelling in the most, and I think this is the most exciting time because and I always think that the stars align, right? So right now we have the millennial generation is the most diverse generation of the baby boomers. Generation Z is not only more diverse than the millennials, but it's also larger. And it's also going to be the last majority white generation, meaning that generation, I don't even know what the next generation is, what it's called, but Generation Alpha, I think is what they're calling it. It's actually going to be all majority minority. So now's the time for our storytelling. So we can grapple with the issues that we're facing, so we actually can craft solutions. And with that, I want to introduce our panel. I think that they are the pioneers of the front lines that are helping us explain complex problems in ways that touch us so that we could understand our future, better understand our neighbors. I wish there were more of them so that the crazy political system can actually tell us the truth of why there's anxiety so that we can actually tackle it head on and continue creating a prosperous union for everyone. Thank you so much. Come on in, please. Where I sit. I'm going to sit there because it's angled. So I want to start a little bit about what mobilizes each and every one of you to do the work that you do, and the stories that you choose. Like, what is it that basically sparks that? Because I think oftentimes we take for granted the passion that often comes with storytelling, and you try to not to insert yourself in the character. So I'd like to hear a little bit about that from you first.
Well, actually, my talk was all about that. So
Oh, I'm sorry.
Seem to be the mic problem person. Sorry about that. A lot of what I do is about research and data. What Vera does is about research and data, and I have just seen throughout my career the impact of stories. I'd worked on something previously with Nova about genetic technology and its impact on families and lives, and just saw that there was tremendous potential to take some of the work that we're doing, the numbers, the overwhelming, data about the mass incarceration, and bring it to life more. And then to use I use a term in the talk about bespoke editorial, and I think more and more nonprofits are able to create their own media moment by using stories. And so it's sort of in my DNA to do that. I'm a journalism background, and it's been great to bring it to a nonprofit research house.
I did my talk on the power of one, and I think I can sort of trace everything that I've done, or almost everything, on mass incarceration and criminal justice back to an early story that I was assigned when I was a cub reporter at KPFA in Berkeley. I did a radio documentary for Pacifica on allegations of abuse by correctional officers of inmates at Pelican Bay. So while reporting that, I sat down for 15 minutes with each of, I don't know how many dozen people who are incarcerated in the security housing unit at Pelican Bay over 2 days. And those individual stories and the power with which they were conveyed, to me, sort of set my path, because it took me a while to get back to it, but really having people tell their own stories in their voice and staying out of it as much as possible, and then figuring out how to deliver that sort of as unmediated as possible, and as well crafted and told, has been the goal of most of my work since.
Yeah, if it's regarding what stories or how stories how we find stories that strike us, or how we decide to support with our time, with funds and with our labor. Most of our stories come in two different ways. The first is that someone is very passionate about a story and is countering dominant narratives, is showing us something that we feel like we haven't seen before, and that we should be seeing. And then the other way that we support stories is by finding something that we feel there is an absence of coverage on, good coverage on, and we find someone who might.
Your mic. So.
Yeah.
Good.
Well, it was going. Yeah. And finding someone who we think might lend an interesting perspective on that.
So with the work that you do, in this increasingly highly competitive media environment, where it's not the traditional 3 stations that you can serve up your stories, how do you break through? How do you draw attention to your cause?
Well, it's always nice to get a broadcast, and sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But I find that hitting directly to the people who you want to educate is very effective too. So, like I said in my talk, I'm bringing my films to schools and school districts. In fact, just this morning I got an email from a school district that wants to show one of my films to all 36 schools in the school district and do professional development. So for me, that feels like far more successful and useful than getting a broadcast, although broadcast also then helps with spreading the word. But for me, I'm always interested in not hitting is a bad word, but reaching the people who are really going to have their lives changed by my work. And I feel like that's a perfect example of that. And the state of Massachusetts also just bought a bunch of copies, and they're using it in professional training for all their school districts. So I'm just really excited about reaching those people. And how do I do that? Well, I actually find out who they are on the internet, and I either call them or I reach out to them, and I tell them about the work, and if they find it useful, they'll use it. So that's how I do it.
And for the panel, I just want folks to jump in. I don't want it to feel like we're going up and down. So on that, how do you, because at some level, folks have to be receptive to that, to having that message. How do you penetrate folks that are resistant to the message?
I think I might. So I don't usually try to penetrate people who are resistant to the message beyond the broadcast particularly. I mean, here and there, yes. I mean, we're trying to get the return shown at a prosecutors conference, and I think that's important. But really, it's not easy for people to flip positions, and a lot more bang for your buck politically and in terms of social change can come from sort of educating people or motivating people who are already educated on an issue to act. So there's a sort of, people in the impact world talk about a ladder model and how do you sort of move people up the rungs of a ladder. I totally agree about niche kind of targeting. That's super important. And so, I mean, in terms of connecting with people who might not be responsive, it's not necessarily about a political difference. It's often about just being really busy. And so not coming to them with your media saying, what can you do for me? But rather, I have something that can be symbiotic with the work that you're doing, and let's talk about it. So that's a way in that's helpful, I think. I mean, one example, I was talking to a congressional representative who has really been trying to push criminal justice reform, but this is what he's up against. And so I said, what do you need? And what do you need from us? And he says, I need you to get a clip on Jon Stewart. And it just so happens that we already had that in the works, and I was like, done.
How cool. How cool. So one of our biggest challenges at Voto Latino is that folks, and the media is a large part to play in this, really tries to silo issues. And so the knee-jerk reaction when we hear Latino, it's immediately immigration, not recognizing how much skin in game we have when it comes to criminal justice reform, when it comes to Black Lives Matter, when it comes to these. How do you expand the allies so that they can help uplift the work and folks that you consider perhaps not traditional, but that if seen together, all of a sudden it not only expands the work, but it also changes people's hearts and minds?
I can take that a little bit and talk also about the people who are challenges sometimes to, you would think would be challenges to reach. We really carefully look for representatives in the media who are interested in stories, say, about Latino voices and issues, and recruit them and sort of bring them along in a journey. For example, this wasn't about that particular issue, but the women in jails. My colleague worked with the Marie Claire reporter for a period of months to really try and help her understand the significance of this issue. And then on the ground, what we try and do is look for brave leaders, people who are prosecutors, who have tremendous power in the criminal justice system, and help elevate the ones who are trying to do things that are different, and use them in some of our media. We'll work with them on op-eds, or we'll have them on a panel. I mean, we have something a week from Monday. We do a lot of work around solitary confinement. So also have people who worked in Pelican Bay. And so we're having a conversation between somebody who's a corrections leader and somebody who had been in solitary confinement for 6 years. And this is a way to, sort of model the possibility of that conversation. And we will film that, and we'll get it out on social and use that in strategy.
So film and storytelling is not just to elevate a story, but hopefully it's to also make impact and make change. What have you seen through your storytelling that has set immediately, with their policy or hearts, that has set in motion something bigger than the breadth of the film itself?
I'm happy to, I forgot that I don't need that mic. I think, at the beginning of the Return Project, and the Return Project is sort of it includes the film as its centerpiece, but then it's all of the short format stuff we do and the archiving and et cetera around it. It was sort of immediately gratifying because we did this short format series for New York Times OpDoc and a series in Mother Jones that the campaign thinks was really important to passing Prop 36, which is 3 strikes reform in the first place. So they actually did the sort of focus grouping and found that it was partially a fiscal story, but more than that, it was a moral story, that people really felt that sentences were way out of line with what people should be receiving. And so we developed our stories, our short format stories, based on that. And then they were used in a variety of ways by the campaign and just to educate audiences. The OpDoc was just a huge deal, this short format piece, and also Eric and Anna on Field of Vision. I hadn't worked in short format much at that point, and I was stunned by how far and how much work a really short piece, how much it can do. So that's sort of the one that stands out as the most concrete, because then I'm not trying to pad my part here, but it passed overwhelmingly in even the most conservative county in California, that reform, and it was historic, and so that was very exciting. A lot of the work we do, doesn't have that sort of immediate gratification, but you see the work happening on an individual level or in certain contexts all the time. And I don't think any of us who make films and believe in the kind of work that was shown today would argue that you have to have an immediate legislative change to know that it's really making change. And I think that's an evolving conversation in the sort of engagement and impact world about what impact means.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, I love when our films have an impact and maybe change policy. But I also love and advocate for films changing one person's life, right? Mm-hmm. So I'll have a film that will show in a school, and all of a sudden a student who hasn't really talked much for 2 years. I had this this was a few years ago. We showed the film as a middle schooler. The science teacher said he hadn't really raised his hand in 2 years. He raised his hand and started talking about his gender journey. And he was this quiet guy who sat in the back, who was very kind of looked masculine, and he wasn't, he just had this part of himself that he had just put away, like I had. And showing the film, he talked in front of all his peers for the first time about this part of himself that he never felt like he had permission to talk about. And I got to be in the room and see that. So that's another kind of change that you get to see, and it's very satisfying.
Well, and what you're describing is something that you also created the safe environment for him so that folks could actually understand the journey that he was going through.
And I can't even say that sometimes I do actually consciously create a safe environment with rules of engagement and all that, and I love doing that, but we didn't do that. He just felt safe by seeing this kid on the screen who was doing something that maybe he had always wanted to do. And that was what created the safety for him to talk. And then the kids in the class were so supportive of him. That was also really special to see.
But you primed them in many ways,
Yeah.
right? So that's special.
Yeah.
Can I jump in? Yeah. I just want to, I'm not a filmmaker, and The Human Toll of Jail, as I said, is something new for Vera, but I would just say that data visualizations, like one I showed earlier, can really be also incredibly powerful in having impact and changing just by raising awareness, which of course all these films also do, raise awareness, to policymakers. So when we released the Incarceration Trends Project, and people could look at every county and see what had happened with their jail incarceration rates, there were many local reporters who, again, the New York Times, it's great, all those things are great, but in this case, we really wanted to go deep. We wanted to get all the local press, and AP covered it, which is fantastic, because then it gets broad coverage in all the local newspapers. And local newspapers in small towns where we have to make the difference were writing editorials saying, we didn't know this was going on in our jail. We've got to do something about that. And we saw that happen many times with the release of that. And some of those people have gotten in touch with us and said, what can we do? How can we help? So that's very gratifying.
So I know that a lot of the work at Voto Latino, again, what our challenge is trying to break not only the narrative, but more recently there was a study that was done by the New York Times, and the headline screamed, race relations in the U.S. are at all-time low. So, okay, so I started reading it and then found that the folks that they had studied, had polled, were African American and white. And I said, well, that's curious, because American Latinos are the second largest group of Americans, so they're not included. So with NBC, through Changing America, we started doing more study, and we found that basically all the major polls don't include American Latinos, let alone Native Americans or Asian. And so it struck me that for the last 15, 20 years, where American Latinos became the second largest, so I'm talking about Gallup, Reuters, Washington Post, New York Times, none of them do it because they found that 3 out of 10 Latinos don't speak fluent English. Well, 6 out of 10 do. Just to give you some background. So for the last 10 years, we could argue, 10, 15 years, when that transformation happened in our country, we can argue that we actually don't know what Americans think because we're leaving out the second largest group of Americans, but then also Asians, who are the fastest growing group, and Native Americans. How do you use film to break through those siloed stereotypes of what America looks like in order to bring in more Americans, but more importantly, to broaden the vision of what America is?
I don't have a specific, I don't have anything specific to say about telling stories about Latino or Asian or Native Americans. But the past few questions have brought to mind a film that we produced called The Black Belt, directed by Margaret Brown, which is a film that tries to tackle a story that is very hard to tell in personal ways, in ways that you engage with individual people and subjects, which is voting rights in Alabama. But the course, after this film was completed and after it was released, it took a number of very different, it resonated in a few different ways. Margaret, we're a filmmaker-driven unit, so we don't often think about impact first. But we try to make impact once the film is done. So it's a very complex film, one that does speak to people that are public figures, one that speaks to people who are activists, and with the activists she tells a story that links what's going on today with historical civil rights battles in Alabama throughout the past several decades. So it's a very complex film that doesn't have like a now here's what you do, and now here's the movement, and here's what the movement wants you to do, and now you're motivated to do it. But it has resonated in a number of ways. I think it has resonated geographically very well in geographically diverse, or whatever, across the U.S. geography, in places where this issue is very important. It did things like it entered the news cycle because she interviews the Secretary of State of Alabama, who has kind of, I wouldn't call it a gaffe, but he uses evidence very casually and in ways that can be criticized, and in ways that prove how he's using things strategically to limit voting rights.
And what's wild about the voting rights story is that Shelby County, which gutted the Voting Rights Act, and the Supreme Court, was the 5th largest county of Latino growth. It had over 200% population growth. And then as you start following the states that went after Shelby County, it's a boomerang. They had 100% or more of Latino population. So bringing that story to light, what was the reception of it? What were people able to follow with?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it's a hard story. First of all, the justification for voting rights laws is often that there's fraud, but it's also saying that there's a possibility of fraud doesn't.
0.2%, according to the Brennan Center. Yes.
There's no way. It's a very abstract thing. And so it's a very hard thing. Like, you can't disprove something that the other person didn't prove, right? So I think, in connecting the story, in making historical connections with this film, and showing, Alabama was interesting because they closed down DMVs, which made it more difficult for people to get the cards that were required to vote. And so there was this mobile unit. And so, Margaret was able to document the mobile unit, which had, it was a windy day, so the apparatuses that they needed to use to take the photos for the IDs were flying everywhere. So, like, you just saw how this infrastructure wasn't working. So in kind of doing the investigating and actually getting on the ground, like, oh, everyone's saying there's this mobile unit and that's the solution. Well, Margaret flew back to Alabama. She's from Alabama. And actually looked to see what it was doing, and it was very inefficient. One of the things that she also uncovered is that it was very hard for people to get to this mobile unit. The mobile unit doesn't come to people's houses; it comes to a place, it comes to a place in a county, and it's not everyone. It's not easy for everyone to get to that place in that county, and that's one of the kind of revelatory.
It's working really well.
Yeah, no. And so, like, there's all these unexpected things that you find, or there's all these, you get, by going there, by going to the story, the mobile unit, which was the solution in one version of the narrative, is a complete failure, in very specific ways.
I started working on the other end of the school-to-prison pipeline with another project that's coming out next year called the Push-Outs. And I think it's relevant to this conference because it's primarily features a Latino central figure, Victor Rios. I don't know if you're familiar with him, former gang member who's now a UCSB professor, expert on sort of criminalization of youth of color and school-to-prison pipeline. And he is really focused on personally and in terms of this issue on broadening the sort of public frame on dropouts, both in terms of how we think of them, because dropouts connotes that people made a conscious effort or a conscious decision to leave school, and so often that's not the case. But also to broaden the sort of the stereotype or the archetype beyond poor African American and sometimes like rural white kids who are dropping out, to include so many Latinos who leave school for reasons of family or language or not testing as high. So that's been an exciting sort of new angle on the criminal justice work, is to think about why people are going in, because those numbers are very related, and that's largely a Latino story.
Well, and I think the more we recognize the voices that we're not hearing, then that's the only way we can actually start addressing policy issues, right? Mm-hmm. That's the purpose of storytelling, is what is not being heard so that we can actually address it. The most recent example of what was happening in North Carolina with transgender bathrooms, had there not lifted the issue, had people not started telling the story, that would never have been addressed. Mm-hmm. And it was deeply more than just the issue of bathrooms, right? It was about personal safety, being who they were. How do you find your stories? What inspires you most?
Well, I can start with that. So I've been working, for the last 9 years, I've been working on two main issues. I've been working on transgender youth and Native American resilience. Mm-hmm. And they're both, in both cases, they're stories that I just feel are super important, that I care deeply about them. And so then once I do that, how I find those stories is actually a really fun thing. Like, I have a film coming out on PBS in the spring about a Blackfeet Indian family who are incredibly successful and prosperous and traditional in relearning their language. And we showed an earlier film in a festival, and someone came up to us and said, we know this family, you have to make a film about them in northern Montana. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, I live in LA, I can't do that. And she's like, well, we'll find some support and we'll get you out there and we'll help you tell the story. And so we found some support and we did that. So I think that stories that are related to things that you're passionate about sometimes often find you, or almost always find you. And that's been my experience. I know a lot of other people, I want to make a story about this, and I go find it. But I've just had this wonderful thing where people come to me with stories, and I find them that way. I did want to just address one thing about silos. I think also it's really important. There's so much emphasis on telling tragic stories. And I really like to tell happy stories, good stories, because I think it's a counter-narrative that actually helps people think about the issue differently. Because sometimes a story that's about the tragic nature of some form of oppression makes it seem like that's all there is. And so this film that I just mentioned coming out is a very happy story. It's about prosperity and cultural resilience and cultural rejuvenation. And as I show it in the community, rough cuts and fine cuts, the people who live in those communities come to me and say, thank God you're finally telling a happy story, because that's a big part of who we are. We wouldn't still be here if resilience wasn't core to who we are. And so when you forget about resilience and you forget about that form of agency, it can actually kind of work against what you're trying to do with your narratives.
Well, it goes back to the person that you mentioned on John Oliver who liked to grow tomatoes, and all of a sudden became accessible to everybody, right? I think it's centering back who our basics are as humans and relatability. Are there any stories that you've wished that you could pursue but haven't been able to? I've never heard that.
I mean, so many. That's part of it. And there's also the whole documentary Ghosts thing, which is a great conversation about what are the stories that you started and didn't finish. What are the
stories that you've started that you didn't finish?
You know,
Tell us one.
the death of the meat market in New York.
Okay.
I did, I started that, and it was right after I had my first kid, and I couldn't go anywhere or do anything that I normally travel to work. So I lived, at the time, it was not swanky, I lived in the meatpacking district, and it was like artists and broken down everything. And I would just put the baby to bed and sneak out in the middle of the night and hang out in the meat lockers with the meat men, and they were the oldest public market in the country. They'd been there over 100 years, and they were in the process of becoming the new Soho. So it was sort of like hearing the family stories and being cold and, hanging out with these people who had been in the family forever, just sort of a piece of real ethnography and cultural history that is, someday I'm still going to make it.
I feel really fortunate because we're at a time where we really are accelerating the way we're using stories. We're sort of like, we're new to it, and now we've made an investment in a staff person whose storytelling expertise. She's going to be joining us, and there's some really amazing things that we haven't yet tackled. And so one is related to what we were talking about earlier. We're also doing a lot of new policing work on police-community relations, obviously something that is top of mind for many people, and there are a lot of stories in that. We've done a fair amount of work in something called translating justice, so helping people who are not native English speakers be able to access services and helping with cultural awareness on both sides. And so I'm really looking forward to having a new colleague who's going to be able to be devoted to trying to tell some of those stories. And I feel like in the criminal justice system, there are so many different avenues to go that we're going to be seeing a lot more.
Sadly, yes, there's so many avenues.
We're very excited to continue finding new projects. We are trying to find holes in coverage in the mainstream media and in public discourse. From issues as kind of large and in some ways well covered as Guantanamo, to just when we see a story we want to in the newspaper and we want to understand what's really going on there. It seems like it's underreported. We want those stories to be made, but we're commissioning and bringing on new projects. So we're hoping that we get those pitches and that we find those filmmakers to make those stories.
So I want to close out the panel, but I want to make sure that we've been able to share and cover what you want. What is your best advice to someone that is starting this journey for the very first time, when they're trying to figure out, especially in a place that's increasingly crowded with storytellers?
to start?
I think we were just talking about this the other day in our meeting. I think that I think a lot of people don't ask questions or don't find the people who obviously know the most about an issue, an event. I think that people are often afraid, or just, I don't know, there's some kind of block there where people don't go to where the story obviously is. The person who something happened to. You know, if you find a story a few years after something happened, go to that person. You know, I think, yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities for important stories to be told, and I think a lot of people, there's a way that we go to the person who's already the most public about an issue or a story, and I think there's a lot more stories to be told.
For the person coming up, it's really basic advice. Make sure your sound is good. I think I come from radio, but I just think sound's really important. You know the basics of how to shoot in front. I mean, I'm sure you guys know this. Act locally. I've learned that. I used to think, how am I going to get to Indonesia to tell that story? It's not feasible, and there's so many great stories where you are, so don't squander your resources going too far and too wide. I want to echo what Jonathan said about hope. Like about 4 years ago, I was saying, what is the good news on criminal justice already? Like, I'm sick of telling horror stories, and out of that came the Push-Outs, which is Victor Rios, and The Return, which is, they both have hope, and we have to remember that hope, in addition to complexity and some of the hard stuff that comes along with it, really does motivate people. So those are a few things, and we can talk more at lunch.
Just very quickly, there are stories in numbers. I think, pay attention to what research and data is showing, and listen to people who are researchers that or research colleagues. They are an invaluable source of stories that somebody who's looking through a storytelling lens can pull out.
Yes.
I would say if you're just coming up, get really good at one element of the craft. Become a great editor, become a great shooter, become a great sound person. Do one of those things really well. And what you'll find, this is what happened to me. I started out as a shooter. I got sent all over the world and discovered amazing stories. And worked with other really skilled filmmakers, so I was learning all the time about how to direct and how to produce. And so when I made the transition to producing, I had already been out there, and I actually had a way to earn a living, because sustainability is really a big issue for filmmakers. So get really good at one craft, make a living doing that, and then some of the stories that you want to tell will start to emerge, and then you can make that transition. And then between stories, you can go back and do that craft. So that would be my advice. And I find a lot of students that I mentor a lot of students and have people who come through my production company, and they're like, I want to direct right away. And I'm like saying, no, actually get really good at this other thing, and it'll make your directing so much better once you get to that, if that's what you want to end up doing.
And directing doesn't necessarily pay the bills, like being a cinematographer, an editor, or sound person.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank each of you for not only the work that you do, but more importantly for the voice that you're giving to the voiceless. And I think that you are impacting a really unique moment in our history where we are going through all these, I call them growing pains of the next 100 years. And we are in the beginning of a new century where we are trying to sort ourselves out, and you're giving voice to what that change is so that we can actually make change and impact. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.